And welcome back, everyone, to the Beyond the Profile podcast. Thank you for pressing play. I'm your host, Shiny. And before we get into the interview with Tyler Steinhardt, just want to go over some quick topics that we're going to hit on. We're going to go over lacrosse. We're going to go over how he helped implement the business of the Premier Lacrosse League, the PLL. We're going to go over the foundation that he founded when he was in high school, and so much more. Before we get going, please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple, Spotify, wherever you find your podcasts. You can also find us on social media at Beyond the Profile. Before we get into the interview a little bit too, we go over the details as to how the PLL implemented their bubble play for their playoffs and championship game. This episode was recorded in July, so you get a little behind the scenes as to what they did. They were one of the leagues that started this bubble movement, just like the NBA and NHL. So really good stuff here. Please check it out. Hope you all love it. Let's get after it. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. Today, I have another good friend on the show. He's the founder of a 24-hour lacrosse event benefiting American veterans in Shootout for Soldiers, co-founder and advisor of the Suiting Up podcast with Paul Rabel, a former general manager of the Lacrosse Network for Whistle Sports, an entrepreneur, and currently the director of marketing for the Premier Lacrosse League. That good friend of mine is Tyler Steinhardt. Tyler, thanks for joining the show, my man.
Thanks for having me, Shani. I appreciate it.
Not a problem. And just to kind of, get started here with this interview a little bit, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, things of that nature?
Well, you can tell it's all lacrosse. Since I was a young kid, it's been that way. I started playing the game when I was 4 or 5 years old, and I grew up in Baltimore where it's very popular. And so I would say, like, if there's a through line in my own career and where my life has gone, it's originated in the sport where I started playing when I was a kid. And then really, like, from my own getting my feet wet into the industry, I traveled to Uganda when I was maybe a junior in high school working for the Uganda Lacrosse Association in Fields of Growth, and sort of kicked off to where I am today.
Exactly. And, the things that I was reading about in your profile, and, we're good friends back from college at American University, same fraternity, all that stuff. But one of the things that was really appealing to me when I first met you was that you were a 16, 17-year-old kid, essentially starting your own foundation. Talk a little bit back in Baltimore, talk a little bit about what got you into that? I mean, obviously you were really into lacrosse, but you're 16 years old. Like, how do you even think to do something like that?
I think that the answer is I wasn't thinking. I didn't know what was bad or wrong. And so oftentimes when I was in high school, my parents gave me the green light to do whatever, as long as I was not in harm's way. And so I would say maybe I started 6 or 7 clubs when I was in high school, little things like Model UN or Community Service Club. I was very involved in student government, and I was always very active. And when it came around to this idea of working with veterans, we had this club. At the time, we called ACT, Achieving Change Together was our little nickname for it. And we had talked about these ideas that we wanted to do on things. And the origin of Shootout for Soldiers really came about because I went to this small school called Boys Latin, where lacrosse is really important. We were talking about the issue of a veteran suicide, which 2011, 2012 was really at the forefront of our nation's mind. There's 22 veterans today were committing suicide. There was more suicides and deaths in action. We wouldn't just think about it. And so we decided to do something, and we did a lacrosse fundraiser, and that spun into what became Shootout for Soldiers. But I'll be honest, it wasn't like, hey, I'm going to build this nonprofit, I'm going to grow it, I'm going to do this industry. It was really just like a pure action point of saying, like, there's an issue, we can just think about it, let's see what we can do. And I had done similar things, not to that same extent ever before, multiple times in high school, but this one really just took off and led to where I am today, really.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, you were so young when you first started. Tell us a little bit about like what Shootout for Soldiers is, and maybe like what was the premise of it when you first started? What was that outline or that makeup of, when you were first 16 years old and you were like, hey, I want to do this. What was the first thought process going into your mind?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of really bad ideas. So first, like, we had a really specific cause in mind that we wanted to honor a former sniper who was killed in action who went to our high school as well, Nick Selkowski, and that was sort of the origin of it. So we called it like Shootout for Nick. And then we spun around to Shootout for Soldiers. And to show you how little I knew about the actual subject, when we had launched it, the whole premise was we were going to do 24 hours of lacrosse games to fundraise money to support veterans. And so our origin process for how to get people to play for 24 hours was one, we had to figure out a field that had lights, which we did not have. So we rented lights and we had those trucked in. Two, we had to figure out a registration process. So our original plan was to do a GoFundMe. We had people just donate to a GoFundMe and then tell us via Google form that they donated. We had no way of proving it or not. They had to kind of check off a box saying yes or no. And then we had in that same Google form, then put their age. And we matched up these teams to have like 24 hours of games. I think that like the origin of this concept was like we just wanted to break a world record. That's what 24 hours came about. And I was kind of giving that backstory because there was so much that was so poorly executed and done in year one that I'm really shocked that we had a year two, that anyone was sort of celebrating us. And quite literally, so to back up 1 second, the first game was June of 2012, held at Boys Latin, where I went to high school. We had one field. We had no lights. We had to rent the lights, and we had no parking for everybody. So we had everyone parked to another school a mile away and then bust over. And an hour before the first game, no one was there. We started getting a ton of calls into our like kind of like customer service line. It was really just my cell phone, realizing that we never actually booked buses to pick people up from the parking spaces to come to the event. And so an hour before the first game with like U.S. Congressman Dutch Troopersberger there, we had a national anthem singer, we had all these people out there. We were like, holy shit, we have no way of getting people. And so we immediately scrambled. Someone drove a small little bus over there and it kind of brought people back and forth for the first few hours. We hired a group. But it really points to like early origin stories. We had no idea what we were doing and sort of fell into it and sort of like got lucky and sort of making it all happen in the end.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I remember when we first talked about it and you kind of put it into action, this foundation and all that stuff. And to me, being someone from Dallas, like there were a lot of friends of mine that played lacrosse. So I knew the sport pretty well. I didn't personally play. But for me, just someone who put together a foundation was just absolutely unheard of. So when I heard that you had done something like that, I was like, my God, like I want to hear more about this kid. But then at the end of the day, you're just like, okay, wait, there were pictures that were being passed around. And then I saw a picture of you and John Harbaugh. And I was like, wait, what is going on here? Like, what is this thing? I need to dive into this. And then I think like a year later, I visited the, I don't know where you guys were, but
in McDonough, I think.
Yeah, McDonough.
Yeah.
Exactly. And at this point, there were just tents upon tents around these fields of different sponsorships. Cool. And like, this is when I think you did like your first sponsorship with Under Armour. Like, talk about that when you're still in college at that point. Are you reaching out to these different sponsorships? How do you get something like Under Armour or things like that to look at this foundation that is basically started by you and a few other kids your age?
Yeah, I would say we had pretty much exponential growth the first few years in terms of our own development. So like year one, we knew nothing. Year two, we sort of refined the process to registration. We had it by teams, for example. We had a bit of a model for it. I think that what really changed on the sponsorship sides is I got advisors. I found people who could guide me and teach me and direct me on how to recruit sponsors, on how to build a board, which I did in 2014, how to get like legal status and build a bank account and all these things here that we didn't have a bank account until I think the second year of the organization. We were just funneling money direct to Wounded Warrior Project. And so there was a lot of guidance. I had signed up my sophomore, junior year of college. I also took like a sports philanthropy executive certificate program at GW and sort of learned some more like hard skills around finances and management and team organization. And so once I started building out those chops, I think I was much more able to go to these sponsors like DeWalt or Under Armour or so much more and have those conversations. But early on, it was really rough. And I have like some old emails because it's the same email I use now, my Gmail, where I'm emailing these like corporations or these millionaires or billionaires being like, hey, I just want $500,000. Like if you could write me a check, that would be great. And like in total seriousness, as if like that was going to be executed via first time email. And so there were a lot of like rough learnings too of like for us to scale and grow into what we became. Early on, it was not so clean.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's where you really first met a lot of people within the lacrosse industry. So one of the things that you have done recently was you were the co-founder and advisor of the Suiting Up pod with Paul Rabel, who's, if anyone doesn't know, is the most famous lacrosse player to play Major League Lacrosse, and now, of course, is the co-founder of the PLL, the Premier Lacrosse League, with his brother. Tell us about like the relationships that you formed when you did this sort of an organization, and how that essentially leveraged you to continue doing what you love in lacrosse.
Yeah, so the backstory from my relationship with Paul actually dates back to the first year actually at Shootout for Soldiers. So Paul and this guy Kyle Hartzell, both who are still playing lacrosse now, were training at Jay Dyer's, this like athletic trainer in the area who's advising me on building Shootout. And early on, he got them to give a quote to donate some raffle and auction items to Shootout for Soldiers. That led to the next year of Paul playing in the event. And maybe I was 19 years old at the time. And we stayed in contact. Maybe once or twice a year, we'd get together, have coffee, and Paul would sort of give you some mentorship around building an organization, who I need to talk to, guidance. I actually came about doing the program at GW because his mom had done that for his nonprofit that he'd run as well. And it was like, oh, wow, this could be really helpful for me. And so little things like that are sort of building. And then by the time I graduated college, I was not in a position really where I wanted to do anything else aside from run this nonprofit. And so I pitched Paul on a few different concepts, emoji keyboard, a video game, a podcast, one other thing, I think. It was an old email or deck I have for him previously. And a podcast really stuck out. I knew nothing of podcasts, but I felt like the medium was really blowing up, and then it was like time to move. And so we came up with this idea to do like an athlete and entrepreneurs podcast for what we saw as a really emerging space of athletes who are taking their dollars and investing it in businesses, whether they're running a VC or whether they're starting their own businesses. You're seeing it now very much so with LeBron and KD and Andre Iguodala and so much more. But at the time, it was really untalked about. And so our thought was that we can do this podcast, which we called Suiting Up, a double entendre between suiting up for the field and suiting up for the boardroom, where Paul talks to these guys about the comparisons between one field and athletic life, and then also in the boardroom. And so we sort of talked, we kicked it off, and we built Suiting Up over the course of the next 6 months, which as Paul's run for a bit, and hopefully it'll shift under the PLL umbrella from a podcast position too, so we can get that back going again.
Yeah, no, and that's super interesting too. And I remember, I think there were a couple of episodes where Paul was interviewing you about how the podcast got started, and to me, like just hearing about how that stuff is run and how it's formulated, just understanding the guts of a podcast like that was super interesting to me. And the people that he also had on too, like I went straight to their Twitter, straight to their Instagram, and followed them right away. I think
Belichick. I think that was the craziest thing. When we got Belichick, exactly. I remember like fist pumping. I think Paul flew up there the next day or that week. That was probably the biggest one by far. But a number of them were the same way you were saying right there. It was just interesting to hear other folks, talk about their worlds and their forays into business beyond sports.
Exactly, and that has kind of like led you to not only like do you have background in like the foundation world and like building a foundation around the sport that you love so much, and then hopping into like you saw an emerging medium in podcasts with a lacrosse player that is your mentor, but then that kind of like led you a little bit to doing more content related stuff with marketing and stuff like that with Lacrosse Network. Talk a little bit about what you did with Whistle Sports and the Lacrosse Network, and how that kind of like formulated the types of things that you were doing that kind of led you further.
Yeah, so I'll give a little funny backstory too on that. So TLN is owned by Whistle Sports. The Lacrosse Network is what it's called, but we go by TLN often. It was founded by these two really creative guys, Samir Chaudhry and Colin Rosenblum. And so they started in LA. They sold their company to Whistle Sports maybe in 2015, 2016, and stayed on for a bit after. But they were looking to transition out of the business, looking for a general manager to sort of like take over the business, sort of lead it, and then shift over. Around that same time, while I was sort of running Shootout, I was feeling a little bit like, hey, I was a year out of college. I was like, this isn't enough. I feel I'm not being challenged. I wasn't growing, honestly. It's the reality of when you run your own business is sometimes if it's not growing fast, you're not getting mentorship, you're not getting guidance, you're not learning how to scale or manage people. And so I was sort of feeling that. And so we'd gone to what's called LaxCon, this U.S. Lacrosse Convention in Baltimore. It was 2017. And there was a massive snowstorm on the East Coast. If you can, like, for anyone who was in the East Coast at the time, I mean, like 8 feet of snow. And I'm from Baltimore, and I decided instead of going home during the midst of it, I'm going to stick it out on the convention floor, and I'll just crash on someone's floor that night and not go back. And like, people listening is probably like, what the fuck? This guy's strange. But like, my thought was, hey, there's an incredible networking opportunity here for me to get my feet wet. And at that time, I really hit it off with Samir and Colin, the co-founders of TLN, and built this really strong relationship. We spent like nights, there was no one there. So everyone was just hanging out, drinking at bars, networking, talking. And I built really solid relationships. And so fast forward a couple of weeks later, they had sort of said, hey, we're hiring for this job. Would you want to come to New York and talk about it? And so in February, I came up from DC to New York and interviewed for this job at Whistle Sports they were sort of looking for. And they talked to a lot of folks for this position. They couldn't find anyone. And I guess when I sort of went up there, it really hit it off. Part of it was relationship with Paul. Part of it was knowing lacrosse really well. And part of it was just like an interest in media, especially where social was going. And so that was really the connecting point. Was I had done this podcast in lacrosse for a while. I had some skill set around social because I'd done Shootout for Soldiers for so long that it allowed me to jump into the lacrosse network and whistle, a space I was wholly unqualified for. But once I got my feet there, I was pretty excited because it's led to this whole career in media now where I am.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that, because this is one of the things that I brought up with my conversation with Trevor. And when he started, he didn't know anything about sales or marketing or anything like that. He kind of just jumped into it and was just ready to learn, ready to go. And for me, I wonder with something like TLN, with Lacrosse Network, what kind of things did you say to them, or what kind of confidence did you have that you could just take over the marketing of this kind of network like that?
Yeah, I mean, all of my early ideas were all wrong, and they were all bad ideas, actually. I think what Trevor's hinting at, though, what I really agree with him, is that when you don't know an industry well, you're not blinded by what's been done in the past or how things should be. And so at AU, I studied international relations. I never studied business or marketing
Exactly.
or social. And so because I didn't know what it should be, I was unencumbered into position ideas or to talk about creative or to talk to people. I think that same thing goes in the nonprofit space, that in the traditional nonprofit world, you have people who fundraise money and they bring in big dollars. And how Shootout for Soldiers was built is we built an event and we made that a fundraising source for other nonprofits. And so my thought was never need to go out to big donors or to sell or whatever. It's to build an actual property that I can build upon after. I think that really that's an incredible insight from Trevor, and I would totally agree with that. Not knowing industry almost gives you some leg up because you're not sort of burdened by what else is happening.
Exactly. And then it looks like you were there for about a year or so. You got your feet wet a little bit in that industry and into understanding the marketing and the content space a little bit. And then you still stuck with lacrosse and you
100%.
you shifted over to this completely new league that is absolutely catapulting from a social media perspective, being a rival to the MLL, Major League Lacrosse. But you've pivoted to a point where now every member of the league and player has an equity stake within this league. So you're a complete disruptor. Tell us how you got into PLL and what was like that turning point of, wow, like I need to do this. This is it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot there. So I think like first when I was at TLN, I started there as with the co-founders, Colin and Samir, and then I hired 2 people afterwards. One of them was RJ, who I still work with the PLL now, and then who I also work with at Shootout for Soldiers, and we had gone to high school with even. And one of them was Jordan, who I was also with TLN, now work with PLL as well. And we were doing good stuff, but we weren't. The growth was steady. It wasn't very fast. And so when the opportunity came for PLL to build a team of 15 people, to work at a growing organization, to be part of the seed round, to be early stage. That was what was so exciting for me, that like I would get to do what I was doing at TLN, but with far more resources, far more attention, and then some management and growth too. And so there are things that, I'll be honest, that I'm really poor at, that I'm learning as I go about organization, that I've gotten better at, of how to work with teammates, or how to work with partners, or how to communicate via email, that I was so used to doing by myself, because it was always a one-man show or a small team of 3, that we could always just talk in person, that when you scale up, it's different. And so the opportunity to work for PLL was just too good to pass up. And I didn't know where it would go, especially did not think it would happen as fast. But I knew that Paul tends to be pretty right when he makes predictions on things, and the funding and support that they had could lead us down a strong path. So that was a decision to jump in the first place. I can jump into, if you want, the growth of PLL too, if you want. I'm not sure if you have more questions around that.
Let's get into that. I kind of want to go back a little bit of what you said of the things that were extremely difficult to you from like a managerial perspective. What were those things that were just complete growing pains that you've really had to learn throughout that time?
I had no feedback, and that's the toughest thing, is that you learn that feedback is a gift. And so when I ran Shootout for Soldiers by myself, I thought that I knew everything, and that I was so smart and so incredible, and I was ready to run some billion-dollar company. But in reality, like, I never hired someone before. I never dealt with employee satisfaction. I never had KPIs to hit. I never dealt with sponsors, all these things. And so I jumped to TLN. There were certain things I was really good at. I was really hardworking. I was creative. I had a motor. I was passionate about it. But there's other things I was really weak on. And then when I jumped to PLL, there was other things that became more exposed I hadn't developed yet in the workforce. And so there's certain bits of when you run things by yourself, you learn to do things the hard way. You learn to do everything, for that matter. But because of that, also sometimes you don't have that growth, and someone saying, hey, you don't need to shut down everyone's ideas, or you don't need to always have something to say. You don't need to always sort of like be the first to talk. I didn't get that until I jumped to PLL, where I was part of a larger company, where I dealt with also more people too. And so that was probably the learning process between the 3 gigs I've had formerly. And I really had a 4th gig too, with Fields of Growth in Uganda, but that was also a very small nonprofit as well.
So let's kind of go into that growth mindset of the PLL and why it's thrived so much. We're a year in now of this league, and you guys are starting at the end of July now. You guys were the first league to implement a no fan policy, like within COVID situation times. Tell us a little bit about the league in general, why it's grown so much, and really kind of implement that social media content point of view.
I think the league was positioned to succeed from day one, because we have players who are owners and also bought into what we're doing. And so because of their support, we're able to really grow fast. And so I think that's, part one. Part two is we're on TV, which lacrosse wasn't. So now lacrosse is getting the platform to be seen. You have players who are invested in what we're doing. And then part three is you have the staffing and funding behind it. And so for so long, the issue that I had with professional lacrosse, they weren't resourcing, especially from a media perspective, what was going on. And the PLL enabled that. The PLL allowed us to run on newsletters and podcasts and YouTube shows and so much more. And so when I sort of look back on it, I think the reason it's been able to take off so quickly is because you have this sort of like trifecta of resources and player commitment and platform that's allowed us to have like hypercharged growth upon launch. And that has been so critical.
Yeah, definitely. And the things that you're seeing now in today's leagues of like the NBA or NFL, things like that, they're kind of run like a media company in a way. And they've had years upon years, money upon money to implement that media and that content. And for you guys, it's been 1 year. So how did you guys know that media was the play here, and like what were the steps that you took?
So I'm not going to answer your actual question here. I'm going to answer the different response. I think of why it's so interesting on the NBA and NFL is that their model is a franchise model. So there's the league office, and then there's all these individual teams, right? So you have a different owner for the Eagles, for the Redskins. And if you want to do a deal with the NFL, you do a deal with the league office, then you deal with the teams, Then you talk to the player association to work with them, and you talk to the individual athlete who usually has an agent. So you have 4 or 5 different partners in what you're doing here. And so you come to the PLL, we're a single entity league. So you work with our BD person, and they will give you access to the league rights, the team rights, linear, which is also oftentimes separated, so our broadcast, and then connect you with players as well from our network. And so there's one touch point, and you get all access, and it can turn on flip. And we have a production house, production team in house versus like hiring someone else after. Whereas other leagues, you're talking 5 or 6 different points, and then you have all these different bullets to hit afterwards. And so when we think about media while it's successful, the answer really is that we're structured differently. We're structured for like what a modern league should be. And so I think if you asked Adam Silver, if you were to rebuild the NFL's or the NBA structure, how would you do it? It'd be much more akin to what we're building here than it would be to what it currently is. And that way developed because it was started 70, 80 years ago. It's like building a modern company now, it's just different. And that's our real strategic advantage that people sometimes don't really realize, is that we move so much faster because of the way that we're structured and built to begin with. And that's really a huge hat tip to our board, Mike, Paul, and so many others who sort of built this company from the get-go.
Yeah, no, totally. And what kind of, I mean, again, I keep saying it's only a year because the amount of times that I've seen the PLL on my Twitter feed, my Instagram, just the fact that there's just so much content out there to watch, like these highlight reels and podcasts, to listen to these podcasts, it's actually unbelievable. Have you guys like found any sort of growing pains during this time? Like it just seems like everything has been so smooth and the trajectory has just been it continues to increase.
It's not perfect. I mean, like there's some things that we've started that we didn't think would land as they would have done. Growing pains. Look, I think that us getting beyond lacrosse is the next step, right? And so we have this lacrosse audience, and for the most part, we've done a really good job of engaging with them and creating content for them. And then what's the next step after that? And if there's growing pains, I'm not sure, but like it's probably like that next iteration is going to be the next challenge for us. And then also like our team hasn't really grown that much. Like we're not like that many new people. We're doing 3 or 4x the content we were doing a year ago. We didn't have podcasts until 6 months ago. Now we have 4 podcasts. We weren't really focused on email until recently. Now we have a new newsletter. All these new mediums, TikTok, Snap, etc., that we're engaging upon. That's not new headcount. That's just being more skilled. And so eventually we'll get to the position where it becomes more of a challenge for what we're doing.
Definitely. And, as the director of marketing, and you were talking about these different mediums that you guys are involved in, what is one medium that you guys are going like all in on right now?
I'm really bullish on 2 different platforms, or 2 different mediums, I guess. So one is like anything that's direct to consumer. And so I would define that as podcasting and email newsletters. Having a relationship with your consumer that's unencumbered by an algorithm is super important, especially as like Twitter and Instagram and Facebook change what's going on. If you have an email newsletter that's a high open rate, 50+%, which we have right now with one of ours, then it's really exciting because then you can like talk to them direct. And the second would be TikTok. I think that everyone's talking about it, but TikTok is also our easiest way to hit new fans, which is why my answer to the previous question was like, hey, how do we get beyond lacrosse? And TikTok literally has a For You page and a following page. And the default is the For You page. It's not following. And so you who doesn't like lacrosse, or your friend or your mom who is scrolling on it and might come on PLL stuff, that's the ultimate goal.
Yeah. And so tell me a little bit from your perspective, you're getting your hands dirty. Do you get into these different platforms to really understand how it works, and then talking to your team, try to implement it from like a lacrosse perspective, from, how do you handle that and implement it within PLL?
I mean, I run social accounts myself, so I'm on it every day. And I probably, it's going to sound bad, but I probably spend about 5 hours a day on social, like posting. It's definitely not healthy. But I
your screen time is unreal.
I'll screenshot it and send it to you after, but
yeah, exactly.
Not exaggerating. Like it might be an hour a day on TikTok right now. And an hour a day on TikTok's a lot, right? It's not like it's Netflix, you're watching one show. TikTok, you're watching 15, 30-second clips. So an hour is seeing 100 pieces of content. But I spent a lot of time digging into it. I think podcasts are really interesting. The difference, speaking of TikTok, 15-second consumption versus 45-minute consumption. And so how do we evaluate listener time and watch time for a podcast relative to a social platform? So I spend a lot of time on these platforms trying to figure out what others are doing. Probably who I look to the most in the United States is anything happening in beauty, like the lipstick and makeup and beauty sort of sector is by far and away way more advanced than anything else in media, particularly when it comes to content to commerce. And so paying attention to like how they monetize, how they create new products, how they market things, super important. And then beyond that, anything happening in South Korea or Japan or China, pretty much all these general trends, what's happening in social, it's like a 2-year lag when hits the US, and TikTok's a prime example. But a lot of things you're seeing of like digital currencies and so much, or happening in Asia years ago, are starting to take over now in the US.
Yeah, and what I find interesting with the PLL is that the teams are not designated to any sort of city.
Yeah.
So it's just random teams with players. I think it correct me if I'm wrong, but it's kind of designated by the colleges that those players went to, or is that
the early origin was the general thought? Sorry to interrupt you before you finish your question, even.
No.
But like there's a new age of fan that, like, when we grew up. I grew up in Baltimore, I'm a Ravens fan, and you were in Dallas, so you're a Mavs fan, whatever it might be. But today, because of social media, there's a fluid fan, is the thought. And the fluid fan is like, I like LeBron, whether he's on the Heat or the Cavs, the Lakers. I'm a LeBron fan. And so, you're a fan of the player, and so you're moving around to your allegiance. And then also, because of social media, because of video games, so much more, you're rooting for fans that have no connection. So, like, I'm an FC Barcelona fan, right? Like, if you're a Barca fan, like, why would you be that from Baltimore? It's just because I play with Messi on FIFA. Like, there's nothing complicated there. And so, our thought is that if we build a regional-based model, we're going to hit 6 locations in the United States, and most of them will be on the East Coast. That's what the current other lacrosse league was. They're mostly on the East Coast towards it. Or we can go tour-based, and we can have this different tour where you can see 3 games at each weekend, go around and hit Salt Lake or Denver or Seattle. And so the reason that we went tour-based and didn't tie regions was we could hit more people on site, and then also like we can sort of adapt for like where fandom's going in general.
Yeah, and I don't think you guys have been around for long enough to really dive deep into these numbers, but what if there's, a couple of really good players on one team that get traded to another? Do you see those fans crossing to the other side to follow that player like you're talking about? Or have they already been implemented in that team from the origin and they're just going to ride with it?
I mean, I would say like probably one of our top 2 biggest stars, Miles Jones, was traded this offseason. And so like we had like a really interesting case where we got to see that up close, where Miles was on Chaos and he built out this branding on Chaos. And now he was traded to the Redwoods, which are probably had the most fandom of any team, honestly. And so it's interesting to see the fans sort of like reshift and align. And early on, what we did in building the teams, we built it upon college connection. That way, if you're a Maryland fan or a Hopkins or Notre Dame, which was really the king of lacrosse for so long was college, it's easier for you to shift over into watching a PLL game.
Gotcha. So to kind of like shift a little bit, we're still going to stay on that PLL train a little bit, but where do you see the PLL in the next? I mean, let's talk about it right in the immediate future. Talk about what the PLL is doing during these COVID times towards the end of July and the beginning of August, and what you guys have implemented.
Yeah, I think like early we pivoted. So we decided we're going to do a fanless and quarantine model, which is not easy by any stretch of the imagination. And we announced that, I think, the first week of May, I want to say, May 7th. So we were definitely the first sports league to announce we're coming back and how we're going back. And that's going to be the championship series from July 25th to August 9th. That'll be 7 teams, all 7 teams of us. You'll play 4 games in group play, and then we'll have sort of like a bracket where the number 1 seed gets a bye, and then 2 through 6 sort of play into a round robin that then get to the final 4 in the championship. And so that's what we're doing in COVID. For the last 3-4 months, it's been a whirlwind of content we've made. We've done like 7 or 8 new franchises in this last quarter. For media, we've done a few different like stunts and marketing opportunities that we created. Backyard lacrosse, playing off like backyard baseball.
Yeah, totally.
We created like a fake 8th team in Beans Lacrosse. Just like ways for us to sort of keep our audience engaged and energized around what we're doing, leading into the championship series, which is going to be the most important thing for us this year by far, of where our games happen and what we're doing there on site.
Yeah, it also kind of sounds like too that you guys are really having fun with it. Like you were talking about the beans situation. Like, wasn't that like an April Fool's
Exactly
little joke? And you sold merch for it, and then now you're doing the backyard lacrosse stuff. I mean, all of that just sounds like super fun. Like,
it is.
does Paul and Mike, do they kind of just, they give you the reins of being as creative as possible, and that implementation is fun first, or what's?
I mean, Beans and Backyard are great examples of content to commerce ideas too. So the origins of Beans was October 2019. After our season ended, we were saying, hey, we're announcing we're going to expand to a seventh team. We're curious what the fans have to say. Send us your ideas, essentially. And so over the course of the fall and winter of 2019, people sent us all sorts of drawings and logos and ideas. And one of them was Beans Lacrosse Club, which came from a 12-year-old out of Wisconsin. And
Awesome.
we put it on Instagram, and people were like, oh my God, like beans. And it became this like running joke amongst the community of the idea of having beans. So people constantly were talking about it. And we ended up naming the 7th team the Water Dogs, which was partially named from Part of My Take, Big Cat and PMT sort of came up with the idea of using dogs, which was the biggest thing.
Yeah.
But beans were one of the suggestions. So anyways, we had this idea. We knew we wanted to bring that joke back because we're very in touch with the community, what we're doing. And fast forward come like March, I was like, look, like I know it's like a tough time with COVID, but we had this joke, this idea. I think we should consider doing it still, where we created like a fake announcement video from Paul where we say that like, things are going so well, we're going to announce an 8th team. And we announced Beans Lacrosse Club. And there was an article written about it too, a little bit about like the merch sales from that day and the excitement and the humor behind it. And that popped. And so once that done well, there was like a lot of leeway we were given and coming up with like these little franchises. And fast forward to last week, actually, we did the Backyard Lacrosse one, which was like a way for us to have some fun and release new merch. And we had these like kind of like cartoonish designs too. So there's a lot of leeway and a lot of like room, for creativity, which is sort of core to what PLL is.
Yeah, definitely. I remember when Beans was announced, I was like, wait, what? Like,
Yeah.
Beans? And then I was like, yeah. And then I was like, I saw the merch and I was like, wait, this is for real. Like they're actually doing this.
Once you put it on merch, everyone thinks it's serious. So
Exactly.
Like, a whole new world to it.
Exactly. It's so funny. So kind of like moving forward, after these COVID times, whenever that'll end, but probably in the next, like, let's just say the next like 3 to 5 years, where do you see PLL going?
Oh boy, I've got no idea.
Yeah, that's a crazy question.
It's tough. Like the last year and a half has been just an absolutely insane ride. And so I think that if I were to answer that like high level, it's for us to be in a conversation with the big 4 or 5 leagues that are out there. And like, is that out of the question? I don't know. Our thought is that our sport's really fun to watch. We're very accessible. We're player first. We do things in our broadcast other folks don't. And so the opportunity for us to break into that larger conversation of the big 5 or 6 leagues would be probably the biggest thing for us heading the next 3 or 5 years. But who knows? At the rate we're growing, it's certainly possible, it feels like.
Yeah, definitely. So I kind of want to reel it in a little bit from talking about PLL from a high level perspective and kind of focus it more on you. You are my guest here. I want to, know a little bit more about kind of your day to day at PLL. And I know these last few months have been a little bit crazy, but since you are, pretty high level at the PLL, give us like a little bit of like what your day to day is there from like a managerial perspective or anything like that.
There's a lot of Google Calendar. I would say 80% of my day is spent in meetings, frankly. And so I try to carve out about a good hour and a half before things get crazy in the day to fire out some emails and to get things set up and teed up. But most of my day is, creating content, reviewing content, strategizing on content, talking to partners or sponsors for things, and preparing right now for the championship series. And so my calendar isn't totally dictated by myself. At times, I just sort of wake up in the morning and look at what I have ahead and realize it's 6-7 hours of meetings for the day. But that's sort of the nature of it, that a lot of what goes on in media marketing is conversations and strategy. And so it's heavy with that when it comes to sort of what we're doing with PLL.
Gotcha. And we talked about this probably like 20 minutes ago or so, but you talked about the mentorship of, when you were at Shootout for Soldiers and how you weren't getting as much mentorship, or there was more of a ceiling towards that. It was kind of like a lower ceiling. And now with PLL, it sounds like there's way more people that you're working with, different sponsors, people on the board that maybe you could get more mentorship from. Who was kind of like your early mentor, and where do you see that kind of going now? Do you think that lacrosse will stay as something that you'll want to do from further on, or has it progressed now to your passion being like marketing, content, all that stuff?
I think lacrosse will always be part of our life, so I'm not sure much of an option on that one. But when it comes to like an early mentor, like first, when I came to Show Up for Soldiers, I had mentors out of it, like personal ones, but nothing in there, someone managing me and growing into it. But the early one who invested in, it was supported PLL, not invested, it supported PLL, was this guy, Andy Cohen. It was a friend's dad. He had built out this swimwear company called Water Everywhere, and sold it maybe a decade or so back, and was sort of like coaching and working in a CEO space. And he was like, look, I'm getting into coaching. I'm happy to coach you. And so I meet with him, I don't know, almost like every month, every 2 months at Panera Bread in Pikesville. And I would come with like, bunch of questions and topics and things I wanted to meet on, and just pick his brain. And a lot of those things were around like fundraising, around employee management, on the future, on shaping up our vision. And some were like much more personal about like, hey, how can I communicate better? That I found the huge issue I had was that I was so excited sometimes I wasn't focusing on things. And so I would definitely point to him early on. And then, after that, I would say when it came to time at Whistle Sports, I had a lot of mentorship from people internally at the company, specifically someone on the sales side, Deirdre Lester, who went from Whistle and is now at Barstool. She's been the CRO there. She joined the board of Shootout, but she really gave me a lot of thoughts on presentation and communication. And then now here at PLL, and it's been for a while, and Paul Rabel too. And so having people, I would say, for any advice for some folks, intern your company, but also outside, that you can sort of lean on, and sort of an informal personal board of advisors goes a long way.
Kind of just moving towards that and giving advice. I want to, finalize this interview with some questions that I like to ask all my guests. But tell me, kind of looking back on your freshman year of college self, or even in high school, maybe before Shootout for Soldiers, what kind of advice would you give to yourself back then of what you know now?
I was very transactional. Sorry, I was like genuinely thinking about like where I was. That came up dramatic, but like I would say I was very transactional. Like oftentimes I would be like, "What can you do for me here and now?" And so it's probably my biggest mistake as like a friend or as a person, is that it's like I'm very hot or cold into it. And so especially going into college, there's so much opportunity for me to make new friends and make more friends. And I maybe came away with a small group of friends at a college, but I could have been a lot more thoughtful in building out early relationships at the time than I was probably.
What do you want to accomplish in your life that you can look back on your young self and be proud of? You've done so much right now, but what is something that you can kind of see in the near future, or maybe a few years down the road, that you think to yourself that you really want to accomplish and you just feel great about?
I've got to get my own house in order as well. Sometimes I think like quarantine's been really good for that, but consistency is probably the biggest thing. That oftentimes I have peaks and valleys very often, and then just sort of having a consistent drumbeat of health and friendships and communication is probably the biggest thing that I haven't done well for so long, that I've gotten way better at quarantine on. But that's probably the number one. If it's like a accomplishment, I don't know. I don't. I'm not trusting myself out too much onto it. I feel confident in the track I'm on. I get antsy occasionally about like, hey, could I be doing something bigger? But I think that's just natural.
Tyler, I want to thank you for taking the time and doing this interview. I know this can be pretty personal, talking about yourself and, about the companies that you've worked for and the mentors that you've had. And I want to acknowledge you and thank you for taking the time and doing this. You have been someone that I've reached out to about this podcast, about ideas that I've had, and you've always taken the time to talk with me about it, give me different perspectives, have me understand the metrics behind it. I remember we were at a bar in New York. I think it was like 2018. I told you about this idea, and your eyes just got wide, and you were like, "I am so into podcasts."
Yeah.
and since then, me and you have talked about it a lot, and you've been one of the true motivators for me to really get this thing going. So I want to thank you for that.
It's exciting to see happen. It was cool to sort of record this one.
Yeah.
When it takes off, it becomes like a viral podcast over time. It can get you more amped.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Seriously.
it's cool to see it come to fruition. And honestly, it's hard, man. Like podcasting is not an easy medium in general to host on either, or to think about, or to carry a conversation. And most good podcasts take a long time to develop. And I think people just underestimate that a lot. So kudos to you for sort of like incubating this idea for a long period of time and thinking about it. And thanks for having me on. I'm humbled.
Yeah, of course, man. Final question before we go. Where can people find you from a social media perspective? Where should we look for you?
If you just search Tyler Steinhardt on Twitter, that's the best place to find me. Half of it's work tweets, a quarter of it's political anti-Trump tweets.
There you go. Oh, man.
And a quarter of it's just like really random thoughts that come to mind. They're semi-humorous. So give me a follow. Hopefully I'll hit 2,000 followers one day. It's a slow growth today.
Exactly. Hey, I mean, I'm not even at 200 yet. So there you go.
Yeah.
Awesome, Tyler. Well, thank you, man. I really appreciate it. And we'll talk soon.
Appreciate it, Johnny.
All right. Thank you all again for tuning in to this episode with Tyler here. I learned quite a lot, to be perfectly honest. I mean, Tyler is someone that I've always known to be intelligent and motivated in what he does, but he's really stuck to one thing that he truly loves, and that's lacrosse. And I find that extremely admirable as someone who loves sports himself. He is getting involved in a situation where they're completely trying to disrupt the sports atmosphere, and I find that extremely motivating. I mean, just check out their Instagram and Twitter at PLL to check it out some more, to see the kinds of things that they're doing with social, and he's really leading that, and I find that extremely, extremely cool. I want to thank you guys for listening, tuning in, and pressing play. Whatever that may be, please subscribe, rate, and review to the Beyond the Profile podcast. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thank you all again. Peace.